Hi, welcome to Future Engineering Bets. I'm Fred Warner and I'm going to be talking to you from a point of view of CEOs, investors and shareholders in advanced engineering companies where major capital and investment decisions will be being made in the future that will change the world we live in, and we need to speak to the people that are doing it and understand how it's working, and I'll be sharing my thoughts on what I think will work and won't work in the future. So if you're a board member, an investor or a CEO in an advanced engineering company, this podcast is for you. We're not commentators, we're not journalists. This is about people that are actually deciding the investment in the future and where to place your engineering bets. Myself, Fred Warner, I'm a chartered engineer. I work with CEOs and investors on defining their future products and making sure that those major capital decisions are turned into effective R&D plans which are governed and delivered, and then measuring back that to the market and seeing whether or not the policies are working. Today, we're going to be going through the EV transition and the biggest problems that it's having. We'll look at the regional elements of that. We've got the powertrain question that hasn't really been settled. We've got the sustainability aspects. It's more complicated than people just talking about headlines of whether or not things are good or bad in terms of sustainability. We've got the great Chinese question. The Chinese market and the Chinese suppliers are really changing the landscape of cars. We've got the heavy vehicles and long-range transport. And I'm going to finish on a little part on the Jaguar question for me, which is what are Jaguar doing, that I'm going to deep dive into later on. And then at the end of every Future Engineering Bets, we're going to have a little F1 segment because I'm an F1 fan. I run a separate F1 podcast and we like talking F1. Right, so with that in mind, we're going to dive into this first segment, which is the EV transition. And when I mean the EV transition, that is all of us moving from driving ICE powered cars, internal combustion engine cars, to electric vehicles, which is the aspiration of many of the legislators and politicians involved. It's not going quite to plan. And one of the reasons that we feel it's not going quite to plan is the consumer isn't ready. Part of the reason for the consumer not being ready is because the infrastructure and the application of the technology is not quite ready. And that leads to the fact that the cars depreciate rapidly, driven also by the fact that the insurance is very expensive on an electric vehicle, which is because the repairability of the electric vehicles is high in cost and often involves cars being written off prematurely, even nearly new ones, which is partly driven by the fact that there's a lack of repair facilities available to electric vehicles, particularly if it's a battery pack issue, which is also partly because the manufacturers have set up the battery configurations in such a way as to make them difficult to repair. And if a small number of cells, or even sometimes one cell in a battery goes down, the whole vehicle can go down, leaving the vehicle basically unavailable down to quite a minor fault. We've got many difficulties in the EV transition being driven into the market currently. The legislators have been driving the changes coming in and setting targets over how many vehicles can be sold of a combustion type versus an electric type versus hybrid type over the coming years. But it doesn't mean the consumer is really wanting that. And the major manufacturers, the major OEMs have bet big on EV, and it's working in some cases. And you'd argue for the Chinese manufacturers, it's really working. It's getting them market share that they've never had. But for the traditional OEMs, Ford, Volkswagen, Audi, Porsche, all of them, they're finding it very difficult to get the same level of demand that they expected based on their investment. Their electric vehicle product ranges are not going to plan. And they're now having to even backstep. That makes it even more complicated when you've got companies like Jaguar that are about to storm out the gates. We're all electric. We've made this decision a few years ago, and the consumer position's already changed. And when I say already changed, maybe it didn't already change. Maybe it was because no one actually considered the consumer when everybody made these bets. You've seen people like Ford, they're downgrading their EV programs massively. Porsche are bringing back hybrid powertrains when they had made a decision to run fully on battery. We have a difficult market. Now, it's not the same everywhere in the world. If we look at it across the global picture, the Chinese market has been and is by far the fastest growing EV market internally, as well as being one of the biggest now exporters of electric vehicles. And that's been driven by the Chinese government, the subsidies, and the transition that they're managing. And you can imagine China is a well-governed economy and a well-governed country, so they can drive the change that they choose to. Europe has a lot of legislation, more than a lot of other parts in the world. But the OEMs are wrestling with the consumer's wishes versus the legislative demands. And then if you take the US and other regions, they're much slower on the pickup. I would say that the geopolitical situation and the change of the presidency in America over the last 12, 18 months has also influenced that as well. When you're looking at the regional, you can't just say EV is or isn't working, because it does vary by region. But how do the OEMs take that into account when they're developing their product plans? Well, that's something that's going to really be feeding into the next range of products, because you can't assume that one product's just going to sell everywhere, which has been the recent planning and strategies of the major OEMs. If you go back 20, 30 years, they would have different products for different markets. Maybe we'll end up going back that way. As a chartered engineer with a background in propulsion, powertrains, hybrid, hydrogen fuel cell, the great question that no one has settled is, what will be the powertrains of all the vehicles in the future? Some people will argue for one thing and some people will argue for another. It does vary by product. If you're talking small town cars, maybe it makes sense to have electric runarounds because you can recharge them easily, on the basis that you've got somewhere to charge them. Because maybe if you have a small town car and you live in a city, there's very difficult parking and getting access to a charger may be difficult, but it still makes sense for a lot of people. You take a bigger car where it needs to travel long range, you need range becomes one of the major drivers of that product. So to have an EV that can't make the range is a real challenge. We're in the first generation of electric vehicles currently, and with BMW launching the new iX3 and their iRanges in the next year or two, they're going to be one of the first out the blocks to show what we can truly do with range on electric vehicles, where we really get a grip of software and efficiency in the battery architecture. But in the meantime, where does that leave powertrains? Well, we have hybrid, and the hybrids can come in many forms. And if you look at hybrids, they can be the difference between, is the power coming direct from the battery? Is it coming from the engine? Is it coming from both? Is the engine being used as a range extender, so the engine's topping up the battery, but the battery's driving the wheels? Or is it, different architectures can be set up depending on demands. Now, so many different architectures that you can go to. But one thing has to be said about the hybrid is currently it does appear to have the best of both worlds. You have the combustion engine to give you the range, and you have the battery engine to massively impact the efficiency and the emissions in towns, in slow-moving traffic situations, and actually the benefits and usage of the vehicle. I can personally say I got my first hybrid in 2016, and the fact that I could have my car defrosted in the morning when I stepped out to it back then seemed like a revolution. Not the same now, we're in 2026, but there are benefits that you get from battery hybrids that people don't always talk about. I don't know why they don't talk about those benefits. Everyone seems obsessed with Apple CarPlay or Android CarPlay, whereas defrosting your car at a set time or at the touch of a button seems like a pretty major benefit to me of a platform. But in terms of this powertrain issue, you'd kind of bet on the fact, realistically, that there's going to be a mix for the next 10 to 20 years, and we'll see it shake out from there. I personally think that the hybrid piece will stay, and it may become stronger, particularly in long-range applications and trucking, because the hydrogen question remains. And as much as I love the hydrogen fuel cell industry, having worked in it extensively, it always stays 10 years away from viable reality. I'd say it's still there today, and you're seeing investment being pulled back in hydrogen fuel cell industries right now, which is a shame for it, but it's just not quite deployable at scale. If you then move to EV, again, getting the next second and then third generations of these EVs up and running will be key. But there's a real pain that the depreciation on these is going to be a factor. It's all very well when you lease an electric vehicle, and you can lease one from any manufacturer in the world and any of these new Chinese companies coming in. But if you're buying this as your personal car, and you've got the choice between a slightly cheaper car that's going to be worth almost nothing in a few years versus buying a slightly more expensive car that's going to have a good depreciation on it, which one are you going to choose? If you're a personal buyer and a consumer, you're going to go towards a petrol car or a petrol hybrid car because you're going to feel there's better return over the lifetime cost of that vehicle. The lifetime cost of the vehicle is really important to people, and it shouldn't be dismissed. It's easily washed away currently with the company car benefits to electric car buyers in companies, but for the personal consumer, the package isn't adding up currently. The next big thing on the agenda would be sustainable fuels. At the moment, we use fuel source from oil in the ground, and the question is, can we, as a global economy, brings sustainable fuels. And there's two main sources of sustainable fuels. There's biofuels from crops and other things, which could then impact food production if it became done at scale. And then the other side is synthetic fuels generated by carbon capture, generated from electricity into synthetic e-fuels, and maybe taken from industrial processes. So sustainable fuels become a significant question, because as much as they may still burn an element of carbon, if the carbon doesn't come out of the ground, there's an argument that you're not adding carbon to the atmosphere, you're merely recirculating carbon by taking it out of the atmosphere and putting it back in. In terms of the internal combustion engine itself, clearly it's a very advanced piece of technology these days, and the efficiencies are gaining all the time. And then combined with the hybrid electric powertrains, I think this is where things will definitely be for the future for the considerable time. There is a difference in the product definition of cars from those wanting cars just for the duties of A to B. Does it do a job? Does it get me here? Does it get me there? Has it got the right infotainment? Am I warm? Versus the car enthusiast and the sports car market, which is very complicated by EV. And I think the manufacturers are going to consider this one of their greatest challenges, is to making cars that are appealing to drive. Yet when you look at the current range of electric vehicles, they're getting seriously heavy. Some of the cars out there are 2.5 to 3 tons for a family car that would have been 0.7 tons a few years ago. It's a much bigger beast. Some people argue that that has an impact on our roads, certainly has an impact on your tires and other usage that you're having. So whereas years ago we were trying to drive cars down in weight, having ballooned with safety systems and everything else involved, now they've ballooned again in weight. Now, the real question isn't, will EV win? Will everybody go back to cars? We'll never go fully back to the combustion engine. What we will have is different ranges of hybrids, and there will be EVs, and the selection will work. The question is which one becomes the major seller for the OEMs, because they can't just have an infinite range of products. They've probably already got too many. I personally, when you look at all of the European brands, the amount of individualization you can get on each model range is quite vast and potentially unnecessary. It's almost confusing to the buyer. There's already so many car companies to choose from. But if I choose a particular OEM, when I'm faced with 15 to 20 options of car I could get for my budget, it's pretty confusing. And then I go to a manufacturer where there's 2 or 3 options. It's the old classic, there's just too many things on the menu. If I was to call out anybody that stands out for, I'd say BMW over the last 10 years. They've got so many options you can buy in terms of the cars. It's just confusing. I may own a couple of BMWs currently. They are my favorite car, but our product definition point of view, they've got a confusing mix. Now, the great sustainability question. It's very easy to say that clean cities, because cars are not polluting, is better for us. It is, right? You go around London or New York and not consumed by diesel fumes, you're going to feel better than if you are. Particularly for me, I think the old diesels are a major part of that. But what is sustainability? Because the thing we hear a lot about, and we're going to be getting into gradually, is this: you've got lithium, cobalt, nickel. There's mines being set up all over the world to dig this stuff out at speed, mostly through the Chinese supply chain, which gives China an advantage in their battery supply chain, because they have worked very hard and very strategically for a long time to position themselves for this. But what is the sustainability? Are we really looking at it holistically, as to say, the impact of digging these minerals out of the ground at pace, and if EVs take off, how much will that come to, particularly if these EVs have a shorter life cycle than their ICE equivalents, and are being written off left, right and centre because nobody can get around to repairing them, which likely means there's a great big battery pile somewhere that no one's really dealing with. And in reality, it's often a lot worse than you're shown from the outside. So we need to understand what sustainability means, and we need to make sure that not only the OEMs are designing for maintenance properly so that the products are ready for repair and are cheaper to repair, but in terms of the recycling aspects of these vehicles, where does that sit? And in terms of the life cycle of the vehicle, in terms of the total cost to the earth, the planet, and in terms of minerals used and components used in cars, are we on the right path? Does it make sense to scrap a perfectly good 15-year-old vehicle with all the bodywork components that are already made versus resto modding it to a newer car? Clearly complications are massive in there, and it doesn't suit OEMs to look at refurbishing cars. But ultimately, we should be looking at this from a sustainability point of view, where we're all being honest, rather than saying, actually, if we just had EVs, that fixes everything, because it doesn't necessarily. The next major challenge is the Chinese question. the European OEMs are being absolutely mauled by the influx of Chinese cars coming through that are particularly EV based. They are cheaper on paper than their competitors in Europe, and they're easy to buy through lease. So you've got a major influx. They've also got the advantage of the battery supply chain that I've just discussed, and they've also got the advantages and benefits in China. It's been quite startling how fast the Chinese cars coming into Europe and elsewhere in the world have grown. What would be a tragedy for the European manufacturers would be that the new legislation ended up with the end of the European automotive companies as we know them, and us all buying our cars from China like we do our laptops and our iPhones. The question I have is how many of these Chinese companies will be there in a few years' time? It's all very well having this car or that car, and I won't mention any brand names, but will they be there in a few years' time? How many of them will come along and disappear? Who's going to buy that 5-6-year-old Chinese car? At this point, I'd say there's going to be a very small market for that. You'd argue some have been a bit more strategic. You know, you've got the MG brand was bought a long time ago and therefore makes people feel, this is a British car. It's not, but it's a good use of branding. And I'm a big fan of the use of branding. But the Chinese question remains, and how the market deals with that and reacts to that's going to be really interesting. My final question on the engineering bets is a particular interest of mine. JLR is only down the road from me, and Jaguar have made an all-out bet on EV. They're not even making cars. They stopped making cars over a year ago, and they're going to be coming out with what they class as the Type 00, which may well get a different product name when it goes live. What I really struggle with is 2 or 3 things on Jaguar that I'd love to dig into is, firstly, the declaration that we're going all EV. There's no room for anything else. They gambled on something based on legislation and assumptions that everybody would just follow it. But they're in a more niche, prestige and enthusiast-driven market. And therefore, to assume that everyone in their market wants an EV is, I think, a little naive. The second piece that confuses the hell out of me right now is looking at the Type 00 to tell me that you're generating and creating a 1,000 brake horsepower GT Cruiser doesn't add up. A GT Cruiser doesn't need 1,000 brake horsepower. Where is it going to possibly deploy that amount of power? If it had been 400 or 500, yeah, okay, that's still rapid. It's still way more than you need on a road. So a GT Cruiser is never going to be a track car. It's not a sports car. So what is it? I think that's a confused product. And I wonder how well it will do, not only because it's only being launched with EV, but what's its purpose? I totally get that putting 1,000 brake horsepower on paper into that vehicle is a headline grabber. And maybe that's been done purely from a marketing perspective, but it's really weak, isn't it? It's really cheap of Jaguar. And it strikes of them saying we just want very, very wealthy people that don't understand cars very well, who want luxury to buy our cars. But if you want and know much about cars and much about what the driving dynamics are and the enthusiast side of cars, you're probably going to go and find another brand. And that's not Jaguar's heritage. So let's see where that goes, but we'll dive into that one more in the future too. The final segment today is going to be on Formula One. Much of the topics we've discussed are being now launched in Formula One 2026, so much as that we're now into the new hybrid powertrains with electrical ICE hybrids, nearly 50-50 power between the two of them. And we're also got sustainable fuels, mostly in the synthetic type of sustainable fuels. So a lot of the challenges we're going to be seeing in real life deployment of vehicles is going to be seen under the microscope on TV in Formula One. It's going to be really exciting to see who gets this right, particularly when you've got several powertrain manufacturers in there supplying the Formula One cars this season. Very exciting times. I think we're going to have tremendous reliability issues as we go through the season. We're going to see many a race not finished by some of the manufacturers. And as we speak, it looks like Honda have made a bit of a mess of their R&D program. And wow, if you were in Aston Martin right now and you've invested all the money they've invested, there's all these backers to be coming out with a car that's that slow, that can't even get around the track and may not be able to race. What a disaster for Aston Martin. If they need any help, give me a ring, because what I do is I work with CEOs and investors and shareholders to look at their future engineering products, help you make your bets, and make sure we've got the R&D roadmaps and governance in place to deliver it. Regardless of whether it's the defining or making sure it's delivering, I can help you. I'm Fred Warner of 7Q Limited. If you have any questions on anything we've talked about today, or if you have product engineering bets that you need to think about, you let me know and we'll have a conversation. Thank you very much.